content we have coming out here at Breakthrough News, including dispatches with Rania Khalek, without having to work too hard, which I'm sure is exactly what you want. So subscribe, the bell, turn your notifications on. If you happen to be watching on Free Speech TV, we just want to shout you out and say continue watching us there, continue supporting FSTV, and big shout to the whole Free Speech TV team for making it possible for us to appear on that platform as well. Rania, are there other things you would like to alert our viewers to?
Yes, as always, Eugene, I want to remind everybody that we are an independent media outlet, so we are dependent on support from our audience. That's you. So that support can come in many forms. The easiest of which is make sure you smash that like button.
Smash
it helps
that
boost
like
us.
Button.
Boom, boom, boom. It helps boost us in the algorithm that hates us. We see you, YouTube. But no, make sure you hit the like button. Make sure you're to Breakthrough News. And we keep hearing from people that they're not getting any of our content fed to them into their feed. So seems to be an issue with YouTube distribution these days. So in order to sidestep that, make sure that you are subscribed to notifications. So you see that bell next to the subscribe button. You can actually hit that bell and have notifications turned on so that basically you get an alert whenever we post new content. That way, if it's not showing up in your YouTube feed, again, shout out to YouTube because they say that they're not doing anything different. Weird. But if it's not showing up in your feed because YouTube's dropping the ball, or I'm sorry, because, maybe our titles aren't as catchy, you can actually get it delivered to you personally with notifications turned on. You can also go to patreon.com/breakthrough news, where for as little as $5 a month, you can become a member and help sustain our great journalism here at Breakthrough. We're always growing. We're about to grow pretty big, which we're very excited to announce some of what that means in the coming weeks and months. But in order to help us do all of the exciting projects that we want to do, you can become a member. And in addition to helping sustain us and helping us grow, you can access exclusive content, as well as exclusive merch, and also thinking about doing even more exclusive content this coming year, a little bit more personalized. Maybe you could have like a Q&A with me if you're a paying member, or Eugene, that sort of thing. But definitely relying on your support. And also because YouTube's algorithm, for some reason, just isn't working in our favor these days. Again, being very generous here. I'm sure it's just some weird glitch or accident. Another thing you can do is you can share this link with 5 people you know. That could be a sister, your brother, your niece, your nephew, your kid, your parent, your grandparent. Share it with 5 people you know so that they can find out about Breakthrough News. Make sure they're watching Breakthrough News so that YouTube doesn't make us invisible. Throwing it back to you, Eugene.
No, I appreciate that. We're ending the holiday season. A lot of people talking about not spending money at various different places over the course of Black Friday and into Christmas. So if you're looking for a place to put your money, that is unequivocally good. Patreon.com/breakthrough news. So we're going to just jump right into the show today. One of the big topics out there for many, many years now is the long-going effort to achieve reparations, reparatory justice for the centuries of enslavement and segregation and other forms of oppression that the Black community has faced in this country. Certainly something that the right wing has stated is, one of the worst things happening, that they're advocates for reparations. In the state of Maryland, the governor, Wes Moore, actually vetoed a little bit earlier this year State Bill 587, which was pushing for a reparations study commission. There is now an ongoing effort to get that veto overturned inside of the state legislature. Very important issue on a number of different fronts. And we are very, very honored to be joined to discuss this by Dayvon Love, who is the Director of Public Policy at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle based in Baltimore City. Dayvon, as always, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Yep. Thanks for having me on, as always.
Well, I mean, give us a sense of what's happening, because I remember when the veto happened, Governor Wes Moore said that we don't need to study the issue anymore. We just need action, and we just need to start doing anything. Maybe I missed it. I'm living in Baltimore. I haven't seen what he's doing on this front, but give us a sense of what this bill was going to do, and if whether or not his sort of rhetoric around why he vetoed it stands up to scrutiny.
Yeah, and I'm gonna provide a little bit of additional context. My organization, we do legislative advocacy, and one of our customs is that we meet with the presiding officers or their chiefs of staff and the governor and their team. So in 2023 and 2024, in the summertime, we actually presented the administration a series of proposals, because reparations isn't going to be like one big policy that just, happens kind of ubiquitously. There's going to be local, federal, state, like a variety of different policies. And what we did was we presented some revenue packages and a structure for how reparations would operate. So for instance, we discussed things like raising the capital gains tax as a revenue source for reparations, or changing the income tax so that higher earners are paying more, right? So those are the kinds of things that we offer to the administration. And what we were told was that given Maryland's budget crisis, that the governor didn't want to commit additional aspects of the state budget to something like reparations. We then worked with the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland to then put in a bill that essentially would do two really important things. The first is that it would study, the specific harms done to people of African descent in the state of Maryland as a result of Jim Crow, enslavement, and all the other forms of structural racial oppression. And then secondly, and more importantly, is that this commission would produce recommendations on how to implement a reparations policy in Maryland. And that part of it is important, going then to your question about the governor's response and that he's more interested in action. One of the things that for us is important is that it's not something that a governor simply can do on their own, right? It requires legislative action, and it shouldn't just be up to one individual person to determine what that looks like. And so so just two things. One, when he says he wants action, we presented some action, right? And it wasn't heeded. So then we, as a compromise, decided to work on a bill that would create a commission that would study what it would like to implement that policy. It is my opinion that there are folks within the Democratic Party establishment that have aspirations for the governor to run for president. And I described the veto of this bill. I'm sure some of your listeners may remember this term, the sister soldier moment, right? So the idea of distinguishing himself from the kind of political and historical roots of the reparations movement, the kind of revolutionary Pan-African nationalist, Black nationalist, socialist aspects of the movement that are the most ardent advocates for something like reparations. I think that the veto represents a rebuffing that wing, right, of our freedom struggle in order to preserve the possibility for a presidential run.
That's an interesting way to put it. And I'm curious if you could speak to the fact that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Governor Westmore, this is somebody who is, I believe, the first African-American governor of Maryland and the third African-American governor elected to office in any state. So I'm just curious, like the irony of having this person who has broken a ceiling be the one to veto this bill.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the challenge is that mainstream renderings of Black political activity in the United States has framed the success of Black people based on the matriculation of individual Black people up the economic and political ladder. And so in many respects, Westmore represents a version, right, of that approach to Black politics. And so a part of what that does, so when you think about the theory of change that is rooted in that thinking, right, what it does is that it makes the aspirations of Black people contingent on a Black person that is agreeable politically to a white mainstream as the basis to deliver things for our community. And the reality is that frame does not provide the kind of liberatory solutions that we need, right? And we see the Democrats, going more to the center as a response to Donald Trump's victory in the presidential election, because there's a core of the Democratic Party, corporate, white dominated, right, that covets voters, those suburban voters, right? For many of which issues that face Black people are not their top concern. They want to maintain a kind of liberal American capitalist democracy, right? That maintains the status quo. And so I think that's the challenge that we're faced with, is that, as we say in our community, Black faces in high places, right, doesn't translate to outcomes for the masses of our people.
No, I think that's such a good point, and I think it speaks to also the earlier point you were making about sort of trying to sever sort of 21st century Black politics from the history of the the black political stream, there is a river, as Dr. Vincent Harding said, and I guess this happened in the 21st century. But I remember the Millions for Reparations rally in DC in 2003, and like, yes, Al Sharpton was there, but so was Sophia Bukhari, who played actually a big role in that event for people who remember, because it was kind of, you know, axiomatic, like, yes, we deserve reparations. Like, this is not, the past is not past. And I wanted to also ask you about that too, because it also feels like it's a severing of historical memory in what they're asking people to do. I mean, I had the opportunity to go to the Lewis Museum here in Baltimore a few months ago, and you know, just learn more about the history of enslavement and lynchings and all these things. And it's not long ago, you know what I mean? And the impact of the industries that have been built up in this state and around the country, the wealth, like, it's so obvious, like how this has contemporary relevance, but it's almost like asking people to forget that and just act like it's not true, to go with this idea from a propagandistic attitude from the right wing that like it isn't true when we know it is.
Yeah, I mean, one distinction I think is really important to make is the distinction between sovereignty and economic inclusion.
Mm.
One of the things that Governor Moore mentioned in his veto letter were some of the things that his administration has done that have been good for Black folks. You know, procurement policy, so that there's more Black businesses that are able to do business with the state, right? Talked about some of his policies in terms of helping individual Black homeowners, right? He mentioned the mass pardon that he issued for cannabis possession charges, which I would argue doesn't really get at the heart of, you know, the criminal justice system, particularly possession with intent to distribute, particularly the other ways that people are tracked into the criminal justice system. These things are good policy. Reparations is about investing in Black people's capacity to practice sovereignty. That when you think about the collective station that people of African descent occupy in this society, that the life-preserving institutions that are necessary for a people to navigate the society with a level of comfort and ease, all of those life-preserving institutions are controlled by entities outside of our community. In many respects, that is by definition colonialism. So reparations, as it emerges from the radical Pan-African nationalist and Black nationalist tradition, recognizes the importance of sovereignty, right, as the prerequisite for any kind of democracy anywhere. And reparations is about investing in our capacity to practice that kind of sovereignty and self-determination. So one of the things that I think in Governor Moore's veto letter is that he is confusing what may be good policy with what reparations is, right? He's describing things that I think facilitate more economic inclusion into the American mainstream, which for individual people may be good. But if we're talking about Black people as a collective, reparations is about investing in our collective ability to practice freedom and have liberation. And that confusion, I think, is a part of the rhetoric that the governor is using when he says, I'm going to engage in action. And as you said, the things that are necessary to repair these harms aren't things that happened that long ago, right? And so, I mean, one example, Goldsecker, major foundation in Baltimore City, responsible for a lot of the block busting that happened in West Baltimore, right? They have a foundation, right, that has an endowment of several millions of dollars. The basis of that wealth, right? We're talking the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, right? And so this is why you need a commission to study it, right? This is not something that one person can do. You need a commission to study, to look at all of these things and to be, and so one thing that I want to say quickly, something that we're going to introduce into this upcoming Maryland General Assembly is a policy that would tax endowments and put those resources into a reparations fund. See, if we're talking about action, right, and we're talking about reparations, then those are the kinds of policies that we need to be putting forward, which again, is something that I think we should study, right? But in the absence of the work to, you know, have this commission, then we're putting forward policies that we think are important to discuss in terms of what it would look like to get reparations.
You know, I was watching like a clip from the Breakfast Club that was making the rounds on Twitter, and it was like Ben Shapiro, and I'm so sorry to even give space to his name, but the host was like, Ben Shapiro was talking against reparations, obviously, because he's like a virulent right winger who is like very much like, well, Black people, that happened forever ago. Black people need to get over it. Basically, he pretty openly like says it almost like that. And the host was like, what about Israel? What about like Jews in Israel? Like Israel got Jews got reparations in Israel. And he's like, that's different. And it is interesting to me, just like the level of when it comes to this country, the idea that like this happened so long ago, just get over it, is so ingrained culturally. And I would say that goes beyond just the right. And that brings me to what I would like to ask you about here. And that is the fact that you and others are now calling for the Legislative Black Caucus to basically override the governor's veto. So I'm curious, what kind of political pressure, institutional resistance is the caucus facing, either from Democratic Party leadership, because obviously this governor is a Democrat, also lobbyists, or even the governor's office itself? Like, is that even doable?
So we're actively working to support the Black Caucus in overriding the veto. And I'll say a few things to your question. The first is that I think one of the things I'm proud of is that when I talk to like just, random Black folks on the street who've heard or pay any attention, most people that I hear when I talk to them, they think it's crazy that the governor vetoed the bill. Like, I think the rank and file of the Black community in Maryland, right, I think generally feels that way. Now, I think people simultaneously feel a sense of obligation to want to protect him politically. But even in the midst of that, there are people who I've spoken to that simultaneously understand the importance of overriding the veto while also wanting to protect and preserve Westmore as a person in his political career. And so it is my read that the members of the Black Caucus are working very hard on this override. And Maryland is interesting because Maryland has a 30% Black population, right? And so because of that, and so we have a large Black caucus. So it's created a dynamic where, we put a bunch, myself and the Black Caucus and other organizations have put a lot of pressure, on other elected officials to support the work of overriding the veto. And it is my understanding that the governor is working really very hard, right, to push back, to try to peel off support for this veto override. So right now, if you ask me, like, what do I think the prospects are? I would say about 65-35 override. Like that, if you ask me today, that's kind of where I think things are. And one of the things I think is really important to say is that the success of the veto override, I think it's important because I think it would demonstrate an advance in Black folks' political maturity around not feeling like you have to both support a policy that is problematic to support an individual Black person who we may think is a good person. But we need to develop the capacity of challenging Black folks in those positions, right, that take conservative positions. We need to demonstrate that it is possible to both care about him as a human being, but also know that on this policy that he's wrong, and for that to be okay. And so our hope is that this veto override is more than just about like the state of Maryland, right, and us establishing this commission, but showing people that, yeah, we need to challenge our own elected officials, right, when they take positions that are not good for the masses of our community.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the beautiful political education effect of actually organizing, is the ability to try to bring these things through. And let me just ask you before we let you go, Dayvon, if anyone is watching in Maryland and is wondering how they can contribute to, the efforts you all are pushing at LBS along with others, where should they go? Where can they look?
So lbsbaltimore.com, LBS Baltimore, all your relevant social media. Sign up to be on our listserv. We're actually going to be putting out action alerts in the coming weeks for people to call their elected representatives and to urge them to support the override. I know for some people that may seem small, but those emails add up and they're important. It makes elected officials feel the pressure, particularly if it comes from people they represent. It gives them the sense that they have to do something. And so if you go to lbsbaltimore.com, sign up to be on our mailing list. We'll give you all the information, the scripts, all the things that one needs to contact our elected officials to help us with this override.
Right on. Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Thank you so much, as always, for some of your time here in the
Thanks for having me on.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Oh, the Democratic Party. Yeah. I mean,
I know.
just amazing. You've got this Democratic governor who's considered kind of like, I mean, obviously he's pretty like centrist, but considered to be like one of the better governors, in the country. And freaking first Black governor, and you're going to veto a bill, not even for reparations, just to study reparations. I mean, if Black faces in high places as a warning was ever like the perfect terminology to describe something, it would be this. Just freaking unbelievable.
Yeah, the late John Conyers used to always introduce a study bill into Congress, and it never even got out of committee. And people used to always point this out correctly, like the Democrats claim to be for Black America, and they won't even study the idea of reparations. But obviously, cannot win without Black votes, which is a whole other category of whatever. And that's why we see all this wrangling. And I think it's also why we see so much like kind of fake posturing. Like I always think of Hakeem Jeffries, who like I'm from Central Brooklyn. I'm wearing Jordans. I'm like doing this, hip hop, this, that, and the third, blah, blah, blah. And, has delivered nothing of note in his tenure. But it's this whole attempt to create this. I heard someone say this about Andre Dickens, the mayor of Atlanta recently, too. His cultural profile is very much like, I'm one of you. But then when you look at his political results, it's like, I don't care about you at all. And I'm gentrifying the city on behalf of all these Fortune 500 companies in downtown. So, yeah, a lot of lessons. A lot of lessons. Well,
Before
go
we
ahead,
move on
please.
to our next story, I actually just wanted to say thank you to one of our people in the live chat. Zach
Mm.
donated $50 to Breakthrough News.
Okay,
Thank
Zach.
you, Zach. Yay, Zach! Be like Zach. Um, if you are in the live chat and watching, yeah, just a good reminder that you can throw money in the live chat, and it helps us to keep covering these democratic hacks and many of the other stories that we're always on top of. And yeah, Eugene, go ahead and introduce the next one.
Yeah, which is another story that I think caught some people here in the US off guard, and that was Donald Trump threatening military action in the West African nation of Nigeria, allegedly to protect Christians. I think there's probably more to it than that, and maybe that isn't a part of it at all. But nonetheless, we are very, very happy to be joined to help us sort through it all by David Hundeyin, who's a Nigerian investigative journalist and author. David, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I guess the first question, and what a lot of people have been wondering, and I'm sure you've seen as sort of the main topic of discussion around this for the in the U.S. media, is whether or not there is in fact a genocide of Christians, and then also what is sort of the security situation in Nigeria. So, just to maybe set the stage for people, if you could give some context about what's actually going on here, which I think for most people on this side of the Atlantic, they don't know a lot about.
So I guess the easiest way to understand what is happening in Nigeria is to understand the context that on the surface, it's a poor country. In reality, in terms of resource endowment, it has absurd resource endowment to the extent that even many of us who live in Nigeria aren't even aware of. And it just so happened that sometime in 2014, when Boko Haram became a nationwide problem, when it became an issue of not a non-state actor actually holding land and actually facing off against the military. Um, it's the idea then was that these are Islamic terrorists. This is a religious thing. They're burning churches and things like that. And then over the intervening decade or so, it's been the case that they've slaughtered anything from 50 to 150,000 people. We don't have actual numbers because the records are very sketchy in these parts. And the significant majority of these people who have been murdered have actually been Muslim because the part of the country where the violence is taking place, for the most part, the north and middle belt, tends to be Muslim dominated, more so in the north. So it's been, I guess, a, a very difficult story to contextualize because what do you call it when a group of terrorists calling themselves Islamists who claim they want to set up a caliphate are murdering Muslims in more numbers than anybody else, right? Very conservative Muslims as well. What is going on here? So what has tended to happen is that the deaths of Muslims has entered a weird memory hole because it's almost not covered at all. And then because these people also attack Christians, the deaths of those Christians are what is then covered.
Mm.
And that is what is then sort of codified into these narratives that are then sold to politicians like Donald Trump. And I would know this because I was part of a research project in 2019 where we actually went around the northern parts of the country documenting some of these massacres that were taking place. At the time, I didn't understand the geopolitical significance of what I was doing. I just thought I was a journalist trying to do the right thing. But what actually happened was when that report was put together, it was two British funded NGOs who were behind the project. The report was called Silent Slaughter, Genocide in Nigeria and Implications for the International Community. That report was submitted to the then US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and the then Vice President, Mike Pence. And the claim made in that report was that there's a genocide against Nigerian Christians taking place. Now, what that report claimed as the basis for that idea that there's a genocide taking place was not that Christians were specifically being targeted and nobody else. What it said was based on the population share of Christians in those areas, the number of Christians who died in these attacks versus the number of Muslims who died is disproportionate. In other words, if there's, say, a 90% to 10% population split between Muslims and Christians, and there's an attack where 100 people died, this is a very crude uh, example that I'm giving. According to the statistical population split, 10 Christians should die and 90 Muslims should die. But if 20 Christians die and 80 Muslims die, you can then say that more Christians have died than their population share. And that was the basis of the claim that there's a genocide, which, as you can imagine, is a very problematic claim to make because there's still 80 dead Muslims. What do you call them? Again, I have to stress I didn't understand the full import of what I was doing then. But it all starts to make sense now, especially when you realize that this NGO that I was working with then actually had the stated goal of that project was to get the US Secretary of State to appoint a special envoy to Nigeria. If you recall what happened in Sudan, when the US appointed a special envoy to Sudan, that was when Sudan got split off into North Sudan and South Sudan. So apparently that was the goal behind this project, which has been running for a number of years. And Donald Trump or the people around Donald Trump have simply accelerated this, I would imagine, because the geopolitical situation, especially regarding the trade war with China, has made them have to accelerate certain things. So, which goes back to what I was saying about Nigeria's resource endowment. Now, if you're trying to analyze the violence from a religious standpoint, it makes no sense because why the hell are they killing so many Muslims? The only thing you can use to contextualize this violence is by looking at a map, a geological map of Nigeria's solid minerals endowment, and mapping it with where these killings are taking place, and you realize what you're looking at. You're basically looking at people being cleared off their land, and the land essentially being turned into a huge open pit mine. That's a very crude way of putting it, but that's pretty much what is happening. And to sort of cover over the fact that you have, huge global commercial interests that are basically wiping out poor people for the sake of what is under their feet, you then have this chimera being sold that somehow it's about religion. Meanwhile, both Christians and Muslims and African traditional religious practitioners, everyone is dying in numbers, and they're all poor people and they're all powerless. So that's what is actually happening in Nigeria. So the recent threats by Donald Trump talking about, oh, he's going to come in guns a-blazing and whatnot. That's what you would call in political terms, you'd call it kabuki theater, because that's what it is. Clearly, the US government has a predetermined interest in Nigeria. It has based on the stated, what's it called, the so-called Kissinger report, which was released, I believe, in 1974. It was stated very clearly in that report, which anyone can download off Google, that the long-term economic development of Nigeria to a place where it starts to use its own resources, its population grows to a certain extent, is considered to be a threat to US national security interests. That has been the position of the US on Nigeria for well on 50 years now. So that is already established. And then you then have a situation where the Chinese government has enacted these export controls against the US with regards to rare earth refining. And you then had, I believe his name is Scott Bessent, your Secretary of Trade, I think he is, or Commerce. I forget his designation.
Yeah.
Treasury.
Treasury, yes, yeah. He went on, I believe it was MSNBC, and said the US intends to build out an alternative supply chain for its rare earths in 2 years. Now, where, first of all, are you likely to get these so-called rare earth minerals in the volumes that you need, in the commercial volumes that you need, where there is no other geopolitical or commercial player that is currently active or that currently controls that space? There's only one place in the world, and that's in Sahelian West Africa. and the northern Nigeria falls well into that scope. And then the what then further complicates it is the process of refining rare earths, as I'm sure you're aware, it's an extremely environmentally toxic and dangerous process. So that is obviously not something that the US government probably intends to onshore. It probably wants to keep it offshored. But since China will no longer play that role, where is the next best option now? So you then have this place called Nigeria, which is a weak state. It's a US client state anyway. It's run by a US puppet government. It's there for the taking, has a relatively weak military for its size, and it has all this resource endowment, has all the exact rare earths that you need. And as far as you're concerned, its its environment is there for the taking. It can be destroyed. All the environmental devastation can be effectively outsourced to Nigeria, and you reap all the benefits. So it would make sense from an American perspective, from an imperial American perspective, that this is what you would do. Why I would imagine it hasn't actually manifested is I would imagine probably has something to do with the fact that the Chinese government, very much unlike China, by the way, actually chose to get involved this time around. Typically, China has this habit of just sort of staying out of it or just watching things play out in this part of the world. But for whatever reason, this time around, the Chinese Foreign Ministry actually issued a fairly strongly worded statement, not dissimilar to the kind of statements that have been issued with regard to Venezuela. So I would imagine that the type of diplomatic engagement between the US and China has shifted significantly over the past decade, and China is more willing to flex muscles now in a way that it probably wasn't before. And that's probably the reason why we're having this conversation, because I believe if it weren't for that, we would have already had, one or two airstrikes at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting thing you bring up with regard to China. Not you haven't heard the US mentioning China in this, but what you will hear often is that China's the one exploiting Africa. China's the one being vile and like trying to be the new imperialist in Africa. And I'm just curious your thoughts on the Chinese relationship towards a country like Nigeria, towards the US relationship towards a country in Nigeria. I haven't heard the Chinese threatening military intervention, for example. Not saying they're angels. I actually don't quite know, but what's your take when you kind of like juxtapose these two powers?
No, the Chinese definitely have never threatened military action in Nigeria, nor are they likely to. China's mode of engagement in Nigeria is verifiable. You can literally just Google it. What does China do in Nigeria? China basically builds stuff. The model of Chinese diplomacy is if we build stuff for you and we integrate you into our, mega economy, then we are essentially building influence with you. That's their own way of building influence. Some people would call it control, whatever. I don't have a problem with that because when you compare that to the US method of engagement, which is basically keep tight control over the political and information space, and basically the country can absolutely rot away. It doesn't matter. The US vision for Nigeria is pretty much exactly what Nigeria is, which is a country that is artificially impoverished. To put some perspective here, Nigeria is now the world's third largest World Bank debtor and the largest World Bank debtor in Africa. Right. It used to be a huge IMF debtor. Yeah, but there's been a bit of like shifting numbers around on the books. So a lot of that debt, officially Nigeria claims to be IMF to be debt free from the IMF. It shifted a whole lot of that debt to the World Bank, right? So it now owes an amount that is worth, multiple times the annual Nigerian budget to the World Bank. And that's how the US likes Nigeria. Don't build any infrastructure, don't invest in education, remove all subsidies because subsidies are not for you poor people. And basically, increase your tax net. These are all in the IMF recommendations, which you can read on the IMF website anyway. Which is why over the past couple of years, we've had essentially a structural adjustment policy through the back door. The value of the Naira has cratered. As at May 2023, it was $1 to about 700 Naira. Now it's about $1 to roughly 1,500 Naira. So the value of Nigeria's money has halved in 2 years. It's still very much an import dependent economy, because again, part of that model for US engagement is anything that encourages sovereignty, such as, for example, the ability to grow your own food, your defense industry. You don't need those things, right? You can just import just enough to keep you going. And the stuff you need to import, which is, US dollars, will lend that to you. But obviously, in exchange for that loan, then you're going to need to devalue your currency. And that cycle of dependency just keeps rolling over and over and over and over, which is why a country with 230 million people and the absurd resource endowment that it has is this poor. It doesn't make any sense except you analyze it through that lens. Now, the Chinese model for engagement is radically different. First of all, the Chinese are not giving you loans; they're not giving you money because they know very well if they give you the government of an African country $5 billion in cash, all that money is going to do is that it's going to find its way to the US and to Dubai and to London. That's all that's going to happen. It's not going to accomplish anything on the ground. People are just going to steal it. So what they do is that they essentially give state credit to state-owned corporations in China, such as the China Railway Construction Company or the China Civil Engineering Construction Company, and they come to Nigeria and they basically build stuff on the ground. So, for example, the Lagos to Ibadan railway line is a 180-kilometer line, which is, I believe, it's the most recent one of the new rail lines that have been constructed. That was China from end to end. The rail stations, the rail track, everything, the entire project, the financing was through the China Exim Bank. And that project now exists. The trains themselves, also Chinese funded. The Abuja to Kaduna railway line, also Chinese. The Warri to Itakwe railway line, also Chinese. The new Warri deep sea port, also Chinese. The new Lagos deep sea port, also Chinese. The Lagos metro system, also Chinese. There's so many examples of this all over the country. The Abuja Metropolitan Railway system, also Chinese. So that's the Chinese way of engaging with you. That instead of trying to bully you, and instead of trying to create a debt trap, which is what the IMF and the World Bank really are, we will rather use infrastructure and trade terms to integrate you into our economy. So you might recall, for example, recently, you saw the Chinese announce that Nigeria was part of a deal that they had with several African countries, that these countries would have 0% tariffs on their trade with China. Imagine what an impact it would have on Nigeria's economy if the US were to permit Nigeria to have 0% tariff access to the US economy. Well, obviously, it would never do that, right? So if the choice is presented between Chinese economic and political engagement, which, by the way, in addition to the economic pluses you get out of the engagement with China, you also get the political plus of basically non-interference, right? The Chinese don't interfere in your politics. They don't fund NGOs that support regime change operations. They don't fund political opposition. They don't fund adversarial media. All of these dirty tricks that the US government is constantly doing and constantly interfering and constantly having more of a say in your own country than you, the Chinese don't do that. So if you're giving me the choice between US engagement and Chinese engagement, and then you're telling me, oh, the Chinese are, China is not a democracy and it's a communist country. Well, that makes no difference to me. That makes absolutely no difference to me because there's only one deal. There's only one game in town.
No, exactly. Absolutely, for sure. Absolutely. Well, as always, David, we really appreciate you joining us, sorting through it all. A lot to continue to cover. David Hundeyin, author and journalist from Nigeria. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. I saw Eugene. I know before we go to our next story, I saw as David was breaking down the relationship that China has towards Nigeria versus the U.S. One of our regular commenters, Stu of Matt, said was noting that's awesome. I wonder if Ohio could get a Chinese railroad. And it really does. Like when you hear that,
probably could.
When you hear that juxtaposition, though, it's like you've got Trump being like, let's take in the military to Nigeria. And then just the debt trap of like the U.S. and the various the various arms it controls of like the IMF and that sort of thing. And then you hear like, yeah, China's just building a bunch of stuff. Like it's like a no-brainer why, the US is obviously still the dominant country in the world. It's still a massive empire with massive military might, with 1,000+ military bases just controlling the entire planet. So, I think that there's a lot of cases, a lot of the world fears the US more than actually like necessarily wants to be subservient to it, just has no choice. But obviously, like when you ask people on the ground, I've noticed this in like the global South countries I've been to, and even the one I live in, like it's kind of just like, oh yeah, the US is like this crazy aggressor and we don't really have a choice. Whereas the attitude towards China is either really positive because they've built stuff, or just kind of neutral or indifferent because China doesn't spend the amount of like money and resources on propaganda the way the US does.
No, very true. Very true. Last time I checked, I think China had about an 81% approval rating in Nigeria. So we'll have to continue to follow all of these different threads, which are important. We want to turn to another important story. We'd spoken to you, I think, a couple months ago now, or I don't even know how long it was, but about the Assembly Bill 715 in California, major threats to free speech, especially those speaking out against the genocide in Gaza and the oppression of the Palestinian people. But now, thankfully, maybe I'm editorializing, but I am certainly thankful for it. The American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, ADC, is taking the governor to court over this assembly bill. And we are very, very happy to be joined to hear more about this by Jenin Younes, who is the National Legal Director at ADC. Jenin, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you with us. And maybe just to start, for those who have not heard, I mean, what is this assembly bill? What does it do? And why is it so dangerous?
Well, that's actually one of the big questions. I'm kind of kidding. But so the bill itself ostensibly seeks to buttress anti-discrimination protections, especially for Jewish students. It's a response to supposedly rising anti-Semitism. As many people probably know, the statistics on which this is based are from the Anti-Defamation League, which notoriously conflates anti-Semitism and anti-Zionist or anti-Israel speech. So it's questionable the degree to which the basis for the lawsuit is even, the law is even accurate. But one of the key flaws, and this is something we make a huge point about, is that the law actually doesn't define anti-Semitism. And that's a pretty glaring omission, given that that's what the bill is trying to fix. And you can't deny the fact that what anti-Semitism is hotly debated in this country, to say the least. There are lots of Zionist groups, pro-Israel groups, who claim that criticism of Israel or Zionism is anti-Semitism. They're inextricably intertwined. And there have been a number of court decisions coming down on both sides of this issue in the last few months. So not defining that is a major flaw with the bill, and that's one of our main arguments, is that people can't know what's prohibited. There's a doctrine called void for vagueness doctrine that says laws must be clear about what they prohibit so that people can follow them. Otherwise, they can't conform their conduct to the law, and it leads to arbitrary and discriminatory enforcement. The other problem is that not only does it not directly define it, but it outsources the definition to this Biden white paper called the Strategy for Combating Anti-Semitism. And that white paper doesn't explicitly define anti-Semitism either, but it draws a number of examples that include criticism of Israel. And it also refers to the IHRA definition as the most prominent without explicitly adopting it. So our argument is basically that the law is vague in what it prohibits, but gives people the impression that criticizing Israel or Zionism could land them in trouble under the law. And so it has a chilling effect and will make teachers and students fearful of discussing topics related to Israel, Palestine, Zionism in schools, in classrooms.
You're reminding me of the fact that it only goes one way, a law like this. I'm just thinking I have a niece who was talking about how like one of her teachers had said, like, in the middle of class, started talking about how his favorite trip ever was a trip to Israel on Birthright. And going on. And if anybody has the opportunity, they should go. And I imagine, that wouldn't be something that you're not allowed to say, of course. This is really just about suppressing speech related to the genocide in Gaza and the horrific treatment of Palestinians and the fact that our tax dollars are supporting it. But I guess I want to ask you about what an impact. First of all, it's amazing this is happening in California, where Gavin Newsom has really tried to frame himself as this leading figure against Donald Trump and his tyranny and his authoritarianism and his attempt to like censor free speech. Meanwhile, he's in charge of California and pushing this, and that's why you have to sue him. But on that note, like, what would a bill like this mean for teachers, specifically Arab, Muslim, or Palestinian educators who just want to talk about current events or history honestly in their classrooms?
Well, so it obviously has a strong deterrent effect because people will be afraid that it'll land them in trouble. And actually, a couple of our plaintiffs, so we have about 10 plaintiffs, they're both students and teachers because they have sort of different First Amendment rights. And so we wanted to include all of the arguments. A couple of the teachers have actually been disciplined in the past. One of them, in response to a student's question about colonialism in Israel, or in Palestine, said that there were Israeli settlements, Jewish settlements in Palestine, and that was an indicator of colonialism, and that got her an investigation. Another teacher showed a video of an 87-year-old Holocaust survivor saying that she was ashamed of Israel's actions, and a parent group complained, and she was initially actually vindicated, but after AB 715 was introduced in the legislature, they sort of re-upped the investigation, and she was then censored, sort of reprimanded, and suffered some disciplinary consequences. So we're arguing that, it's already bad, and this law is going to make it even worse. So, and the second teacher that I mentioned, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No. Well, I know I want to hear about the second teacher, but I also wanted to add on to that. What you're talking about is so important. I want to remind everyone this is happening in like the largest state in the country, California. And if it does stand, this could have a chilling effect and be implemented across the country. But please continue about the second teacher you were talking about.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, she's fairly certain that this happened because the bill was floating around and the parent groups felt emboldened. And they actually took credit for getting her in trouble on Facebook. Stand With Us said, success, we got the teacher in trouble for showing this video. And I mean, ironically, they were claiming that the video blamed all Jews for what was happening in Gaza, whereas she was trying to make the opposite point, that this is a Jewish Holocaust survivor who's condemning it, and not all Jews are responsible for what's happening in Gaza. So the way things are twisted to discipline teachers it's already having a severe chilling effect, and this law will make it worse. It's technically supposed to go into effect January 1st, but the language of the law is actually sort of unclear and says it should be implemented as soon as possible. So it's possible that districts are already making changes to accommodate it.
Yeah, amazing. Great point you made there, Rania. I think 1 in 8 of all K through 12 students in the country are in California, so huge impact here. And it feels that there's just a slippery slope aspect to this as well, because obviously, it's politicizing speech in a way that, if they succeed here with this sort of, push, that on many different fronts, you could see similar sorts of things. And the next time you turn around, you can't say anything.
Yeah, there already are other states that have similar laws. They just haven't gotten much attention. So a lot have sort of quietly adopted the IHRA definition, actually, when it comes to enforcing civil rights law. So it's already a big problem. Wisconsin is looking at a similar but worse law. And California sort of tends to be the laboratory. A lot of states will look to see what happens in California. And then if this law doesn't get struck down, then they may seek to emulate it. So I think the case is important, and we're hoping we can stop the law in its tracks before it even takes effect.
Well, in that note, I want to ask you about the legal case and as it stands, because I'm curious, what are the key legal arguments in terms of, violating constitutional protections, particularly around the First Amendment and equal protection? And what is the ADC asking the court to do? Like, what would it mean if the court grants your request to block the law from taking effect?
So the arguments that the lawsuit raises are, the first one, which I discussed, was void for vagueness doctrine. So that says the law is so vague that nobody can be sure what it means to violate it, and so you can't conform your conduct. That's a problem. Then we have the First Amendment rights of the teachers and the students, actually. So there's a First Amendment corollary to the right to speak, which is the right to receive information. And actually, it's a little bit stronger for students than it is for teachers. Courts are somewhat understandably skeptical, or they don't really grant teachers full First Amendment rights. And I can sort of understand the basis for that, right? They don't they're sympathetic to the idea that there can be limitations placed on teachers' ability to just go into the classroom and sort of air their own political views and make things about their ideas. And you can see it, from the other point of view. If you have a Zionist teacher or, pro-Israel teacher, I wouldn't want that kid going into the classroom and just preaching pro-Israel content to my child either. So there are, some sort of restrictions on the degree to which teachers have First Amendment protections. They're more limited, but students should be able to engage in robust discussions, and teachers should be able to respond to their questions. So that's why we raised the First Amendment rights of both teachers and students. And I think, so while there are limitations that can be based on curricula, what I think the courts are not sympathetic to is the idea that one viewpoint can be forbidden while the other one is permitted. And so this law is viewpoint discriminatory. That's what we're arguing. So I think it might be fair to say teachers have to give air to both views, say that some people think this, some people think that. But to say you can only air the pro-Israel view is a problem. And so that's sort of the basis for the lawsuit. And what we're actually asking for emergency relief. So there's currently a hearing scheduled for the 16th of December. These things sometimes change, but currently. And we're asking for sort of what's called a preliminary injunction, which is for a judge to enjoin the law. So tell Newsom and his agents and officers that they cannot enforce this law, and it's basically not in effect. And then we go through the whole lawsuit, and then we want a permanent injunction at the end. So we're not seeking money or anything like that, just don't want the law to be in effect.
Mm-hmm. And Jenin, for those who might be watching who want to continue to follow the efforts of ADC, and if they so choose, support your efforts, is there anywhere they should look, anywhere they should go?
Yes, you can go to our website. It's adc.org. And if you would like to support us, we have a donate button. We're survive on grassroots funding, so we very much appreciate any help we can get.
Mm-hmm. Longtime venerable civil rights organization defending free speech and many other things. Jenin Younes, National Legal Director at ADC. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Well, she's doing really important work there, you guys. And I got to say, as an Arab American myself, the ADC really is the only civil rights organization for Arab Americans. And this work is super important. I mean, I remember growing up and going to high school here in Virginia, where I'm talking to you from right now. And, I was often alone in my views on Palestine back then. And I had to hear teachers just teach wrong information, either because they were ideological, or sometimes that was just the mainstream view and understanding of what was going on. And I think one thing that's different today is that the vast majority of young people are very pro-Palestine. They're very much on social media. They've seen a live stream genocide. And so this is a really desperate attempt to try to control speech in our public schools so that you can, make sure that the 6th graders and 7th graders and 9th graders aren't hearing any pro-Palestine views from the faculty.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And, we had the opportunity to be there at the ADC convention a little bit earlier this year. I don't actually know if the video is even still on our website, but I was able to attend a great panel of educators talking about this issue, talking about, of course, this bill, but also just across the country and the impacts on students, on teachers. And you had teachers, you had parents, you had sort of people who are just community educators. Very, very interesting to see. And by interesting, I mean terrible, the difficulties in trying to get in just truthful information about Palestine, West Asia, Arab Americans. I mean, even the difference between, Arab Americans as an ethnicity and Muslims as a religion, which you think would be obvious, but for many people is not. Just the most basic of information that people are struggling to get accepted. So very important lawsuit. I think very important moment here for us, because in the backlash, I think, of what's been happening with this huge movement in solidarity with Palestine, all these little efforts are now coming in to try to curtail the possibilities of that being built on. So we'll continue to follow it. We'll continue to cover it in all of its various different facets. But we're going to move on for now. We want to move on to another big story this week, which I guess now is the end of the government shutdown, the federal government shutdown that wreaked so much havoc on so many people, especially those who need food assistance from SNAP. And a lot of conversation about the Democrats and what they didn't do in their role in facilitating the reopening of the government. And how we got here and just the venality of the Republicans as well and the policies they shut the government down over, which is stripping people from healthcare and sending people to starve. Nonetheless, before I editorialize too much, let's bring in our guest here on the show. We are very, very honored to be joined for this segment by Nathan Robinson, who is the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs and the co-author, along with Noam Chomsky, of The Myth of American Idealism: How U.S. Foreign Policy Endangers the World. Nathan, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Hey, Eugene. Hey, Rania. Nice to see you.
Well, great to have you with us. And I mean, there's obviously so many threads we could pick up on here. I mean, one thing I was thinking about this morning is, there's so much focus obviously on the 8 Democrats who capitulated, who gave Trump this win. But to me, it just feels just notable. Like, not that long before the shutdown, you had the mayor of Chicago say, let's have a general strike in this country to push back. The government shuts down. The Democrats say this is horrible. And then they just kind of say it's horrible and sort of sit on their hands. So it seems to me like even when you look at the 8 people are obviously terrible, but then I think about all these other people in Congress and the Senate and the governors not calling for mass mobilization, all these different pieces. It just sort of felt like, I don't even know what to say, like just all up and down the line, a very limp opposition to what was obviously a terrible move by the Republicans to gut healthcare and other forms of social assistance. But anyway, I am editorializing now, but some of your thoughts maybe perhaps now that the government has technically reopened.
The tragedy of it is that during the shutdown, these Democrats who had been so weak and had been disappointing so many people and had really been out of touch with the popular anger at the Trump administration, which, I mean, we saw in the big No Kings protest, there's a lot of rage and a lot of demand for Democrats to take the kind of militant stance that you're talking about. Well, the shutdown had actually been quite encouraging because there they were holding the line. There they were with a concrete demand, which was a material demand that actually would have helped people, right, to continue the Obamacare subsidies. And they weren't giving in. And people saw that they weren't giving in, and they, in fact, voted for Democrats overwhelmingly in the elections that we just had. So what was going on, was something pretty encouraging, which was Democrats understanding that their base wanted to see them hold firm against the Trump administration's worst policies. And so that's why, it ending the way it did is just so pathetic and typical and feels like such a return to form. And, obviously a lot of the blame, I wrote this big article about Chuck Schumer, who I think really disgraced himself in this, where, he managed to not be among the 8, but still very clearly be unable to control or unwilling to control his caucus and lead them during this moment where they had been, the polls show that this was what people wanted to see.
Nathan, with that in mind, I am wondering, do you think we're witnessing a failed negotiation here? Or was this maybe performative from the start? Did Democratic leaders ever intend to actually fight for healthcare protections? Or, the more cynical side of me, and I think this is true, was this more about managing public perception? Because to what Eugene was saying, there was so much antagonism and disdain for the Republicans refusing to extend healthcare subsidies. And I think that goes, a lot of that across the board, except for the diehard MAGA people. And the Democrats were actually in quite a good position here. The recent election showed that. And they just threw that away. By handing this over with literally zero. They got nothing out of this. People are gonna hurt after hurting from the shutdown. We're all gonna hurt, actually. All of our healthcare premiums are gonna go up. So they could have mobilized people, but they didn't. So did they ever actually mean to win anything here?
Well, I mean, motives may differ among Democrats. So there may be members of the caucus who were very serious, and there may be others who went along just as you say, for the sake of maintaining public appearances, knowing that there was an angry popular demand. I think what is true is that there was no unified strategy or vision of how this was going to go. As I understand it, what this was sort of inevitably moving towards was a point at which Republicans, who were never going to give in on the Obamacare issue, were going to probably abolish the filibuster. That's what I understand. And I think there are enough Democrats who didn't want to force that kind of showdown that this was always going to end the way it did. And so, yes, you're right that from the start, it is the case that there was not a unified party strategy that said we are willing to ride this out to the end, even though riding it out to the end would ultimately have showed the Republicans to be willing to take radical steps, including abolishing the filibuster, in order to ensure that people didn't get affordable health care. And, as this went on, they were really exposing that Republicans would rather starve the poor than give people affordable health care. I mean, for them, that's almost a bonus. You get to starve the poor and you get to deprive people of affordable health care. But I think it's very clear from the start that Democrats were not committed to a real showdown here and weren't willing to accept the stakes of that showdown.
I think that's a really good point. And I mean, I think it also speaks to sort of how, a lot of these political issues have been framed and how a certain segment of the Democrats, for sure, want to frame them in terms of what's popular and what's not. But I think that the point you just made is one a lot of people were speaking to, is that it not only would reveal Republicans, but it's such an extreme agenda. I mean, forget just the ACA. I mean, universal healthcare is very popular in this country. Obviously, many of the other policies are very popular. Certainly, taking $1 trillion away from Medicaid, ACA, and SNAP in order to give $1 trillion to the richest people and tax cuts is like not popular. And it feels like there's also this thing that's sort of nested in the conversation within the Democratic Party that, the sort of broadly popular policies, which, are certainly embodied by a lot of politicians, the Bernie Sanders of the world and people like that, that somehow they aren't popular. And somehow we have to maintain a certain level of centrism, and like pushing hard on these things is somehow going to hurt us, not help us.
I think something really important in what you're saying there, Eugene, is that, for all that I appreciate that the demand in this shutdown was something, as I say, something material, right? Protecting people's healthcare subsidies. It's protecting what already exists, the disappointing status quo. And I think what's very clear is that even though you had a certain number of the Senate Democrats who were willing to force a showdown over protecting the status quo was very bad. Right? Obamacare doesn't work for a lot. It's already incredibly expensive for a lot of people. The Affordable Care Act didn't work. Healthcare is not affordable. If it had worked, healthcare would be affordable, and it isn't, so it didn't work. It was a failure. And there is a total lack, right? There is some willingness to fight to some degree to protect the little crumbs that we have from the Republican effort to just totally dismantle the social welfare programs. But there is almost no effort, as you say, to provide an alternative vision for something better. And this is what Bernie's saying all the time. He's saying, there's no acknowledgement among Democrats that there is something fundamentally broken about the healthcare system.
It's also this like weird obsession with like wanting the right to like them. I mean, there's a lot happening here. There's also like, what's the Democratic Party, right? It's like a corporation that's funded by health insurance industry, pharmaceutical industry. I don't think that the centrist leadership of that party, the so-called moderates, even though there's nothing moderate about them. I think that they are inclined to do the bidding of their donors, not the bidding of the base that supports this party. But also at the end of the day, we've seen extreme cowardice in the face of a really scary administration. Like, Trump is consolidating power. He literally says the Democratic Party is a terrorist organization. He makes no distinction between like people like us and the centrists of the Democratic Party. Like, right. His Justice Department is being weaponized to go after everybody left of MAGA, which includes the vast majority of the country. But like, what do you get? You get the sort of like, what you get is a win for the people like James Carville, the sort of consultant class that are like, yeah, roll over and play dead. It's like there's a massive
You're quoting
assault.
him directly, by the way.
Yeah, that's literally what he said, is the Democrats should roll over and play dead. And that is what the core of the party leadership has decided to do, which is why amidst this horrific attack from every angle on us, like it just every day is like some new war on the people of this country from this administration, It seems like there's zero protection from the party in opposition. They're kind of silent or non-existent. So it's like the shutdown was for the first time them seemingly doing something. And even then they just threw it down the toilet. I know I'm commenting more than asking a question, but please, your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, Rania, you're being a little unfair to Chuck Schumer because he famously said that when Trump was trying to extort universities into giving the government giant piles of money and restricting campus free speech, he said he was writing a very strong letter to the Trump administration demanding an explanation. I mean, that's his words. If you watch him in these press conferences, I mean, he has absolutely no ability to inspire anyone, absolutely no leadership skills. And what's very strange is it seems as if that's what Senate Democrats want. Like, we have to conclude that they don't want someone who is an effective and capable leader. I believe Chuck Schumer came in 2017 as the Senate Democrat leader. And since then, he has become totally unpopular with the American people, right? His approval rating is, I think, minus 33. Whereas like Bernie Sanders has like a +7 favorability among the American people. So, I mean, if you cared at all about having a fighting party that actually was an effective opposition, and you realized that the American people despised the guy you had as leader, that they found him totally uninspiring, that most people didn't even know who he was, and if they did know who he was, they didn't like him. I mean, you would get rid of him yesterday. They've kept him since 2017. And at a certain point, you have to conclude that they want to fail, or at least, as you say, that they are more committed to doing donors' bidding than to actually achieving anything.
Well, I have a third conspiracy, and that is that they are all undercover Republicans. Hey, you don't know. Maybe it could be possible. That'd be brilliant, right? Like if the Republicans just had like undercover agents running the Democratic Party.
Well, but you're right in a certain sense. I mean, that's just true in a certain sense, in that, I mean, it's like AOC said, you know, in a different country, she and Joe Biden wouldn't be in the same party, right? Because we don't have a left party in this country. Democrats generally are fairly conservative, and they're not that far from, they have historically not been that far between the two parties. There hasn't been that much distance on a lot of issues. I mean, even Obamacare, right, is a market-based policy. There's almost no constituency within
it's Romney care.
Yeah, right. It's Romney care, right? I mean, it's a bipartisan initiative. Of course, Republicans have gone so far to the right that it obscures the fact that you're talking about, which is that Democrats could, in a sense, have been moderate Republicans in like 1996.
Good point. The Republican healthcare plan now is like the feudal healthcare plan. Just bring back leeches in the time before there is any vaccine.
Yeah.
Real quick before we let you go, Nathan, you mentioned the article you wrote. Where can people follow Current Affairs?
Yeah, if they go to currentaffairs.org, or they follow us on Twitter /X at CUR Affairs. We're also on Instagram, Current Affairs Magazine. We have a beautiful print edition that people can subscribe to. And yeah.
Fantastic. Well, as always, appreciate you. Well, not as always, first time on the show. Great to have you here on the show.
Yeah, so nice to finally get to talk to y'all.
Absolutely. Take care, Nathan.
Well, there you have it, guys. The Democratic Party, or, you know, the Republican Party light. I mean, it's unbelievable. And I really am worried. I mean, it's like you look at these insurance premiums, and it's not just the premiums, it's the deductibles. And then it's like the co-insurance and on. And it's just like, at this point, like I've seen they're planning on doing deductibles as high as like $20,000. Like, what? That means you have to spend $20,000 before your insurance kicks in.
Yeah, essentially you have to have
like who has that kind of money?
You can do that. No one.
Yeah, like
that's
I
why
just
the
like
number one cause of bankruptcy is medical bankruptcy.
As I made very clear when I came back, because I was gone for most of the month of October, it's because I had to get surgery on my neck. My scar's in the back. That's why you can't see it, but I swear I got surgery. That'd be a weird thing to lie about. But the point is like, you know, neck surgery, spinal surgery, pretty serious stuff. Not cheap. It wasn't something I wanted to do. It was something I had to do. And I still had to pay 40. Wow. No, God help me. Maybe next year I still had to pay $4,000. That's a lot of money. I had to pay
Yes.
$4,000, and I remember them calling me up before and being like, "Hey, here's how much you have to pay," because that's my deductible. They were like,
Mhm.
Do you want to go on a payment plan?" And I'm like, "This is how people go into medical debt." It's just completely insane. And then you know what's funny about that, Eugene? And I promise I'll stop complaining about health insurance because we're going to get to the Jeffrey Epstein drama.
Yeah.
Is I also, in addition to that, like I got this bill from the anesthesiologist, and it was like, you owe $490, and then like the actual like anesthesia and everything that went with it cost. It was like $13,000, but then it had health insurance adjustment, like for the provider, the health insurance provider, and they gave them a $13,000 or $11,000 discount. So then the insurance provider just had to pay like $1,000 something. So I'm like, health insurance companies don't even actually have to pay the amount that the providers charge, which is like a whole nother thing I don't quite understand. But now I'm just gonna, stop me before I just spend the next hour talking about
There's a lot you could
horrible
say.
our health
People should
insurance
Google
system is.
pharmacy
Yeah.
benefit managers and what they do. Some of the biggest companies. But one thing I'll just say before we leave healthcare, I was once in the ER, and I'll never forget this. And like two beds down from me was a guy who had OD'd on fentanyl. And the people who've been in the ER, they come around oftentimes like the little computer or whatever for you to pay right there, because obviously you got to pay. And the guy wakes up. He'd OD'd on fentanyl, so he wakes up, and it was like 2 minutes after he woke up, they rolled up to him with the little machine and were like, "Sir, how do you want to pay?" And I just thought,
Amazing.
damn, like you couldn't even give him 5 minutes. This dude was OD.
Vicious.
And it was like,
That's
hey, we need to get this
vicious.
money. And it was like, do you want to pay via, cash, check, or card? Like it was like you got to pay. So anyway, that's that. But before we get out of here today, I guess we want to say a little bit about the ongoing issue with the Epstein files or things that are being released from investigative reports here regarding Donald Trump. And since the president is very litigious, I think important to say here that this is just emails that have been released from Jeffrey Epstein making certain allegations about President Donald Trump. Many believe them to be true. Some elements of them are disputed by the White House. So just want to note that at the outset here. But there's been the emails from Epstein and some of them have also involved other people. Like that's what's starting to happen as some of these are coming out. House Democrats started it. Republicans have released some of it. But I think the two big things that everyone is talking about, Rania, are the three emails. The one from Mr. Epstein to Ghislaine Maxwell, where he was stating that Trump had spent a lot of time in his home and, was aware of certain facts about things that were going on there. As Epstein was certain things that he was convicted of course, as we know, in terms of underage women and girls. And then the other two to the author Michael Wolff, who people may remember is the guy who wrote those two tell-all books about Trump, essentially discussing, and the first email was I think in 2011, and these were in I think 2019, discussing the sort of revival of the allegations against Trump around Epstein, and Epstein stating very affirmatively that Trump was very aware of what took place, 100% aware, because he had actually asked Ghislaine Maxwell to stop. And I think that was, from what I can surmise, based on the information I have read, a reference to the potential trafficking, including of people like Virginia Jeffrey, at the Mar-a-Lago estate, which Trump apparently spoke to the Epstein camp about stopping because there were members who were complaining about their daughters and others being approached. So that is what everyone's talking about, sort of an extension of the long-term issue. It's become a major issue for Trump because, of course, he built up the Epstein files to such a huge degree as a sign of the deep state. And then as soon as he got in there, it seems like there's been quite a bait and switch. I think the sort of kernel of this that, amidst everything else, is really the biggest issue for Trump is, if he was aware, did he go to the authorities? And if he did not go to the authorities, then that would mean that he essentially was involved in, you could call it a cover-up, looking the other way, but in serious crimes, and chose not to. Now, of course, we don't know, and I think this is why people are saying that more needs to be released to see what exactly he knew or did in relationship to information that Epstein is alleging that Trump had. And so I think we'll continue to see a back and forth around that as we move forward. But, a big potential political pitfall here for him because A, yes, the issue is in and of itself explosive because the crimes that were committed by Epstein are obviously horrible crimes, but B, because Trump himself is the one who built this up as the litmus test for taking down the deep state. Like this is the thing that we're going to reveal when we get in there that shows how corrupt the government is. And many people, want to see government malfeasance and corruption rooted out. And I think that many of them, or there are a number of people who voted for Trump hoping that he would indeed uproot this so-called deep state and root out corruption and malfeasance in the government. And now I think it appears to many of them that he is not doing that and is acting just like other politicians in the past, which could mean a serious erosion of his support. And that going into the midterms could mean that he could lose support in Congress because people don't want to lose their seats because, MAGA people are upset about this, which means that his power, which is very much based on being more popular than all Republicans in Congress, could be at risk. And that could result in some serious political changes in the country if a number of Republicans start to go rogue in Congress.
Well, Eugene, where should I start for my end of things? I want to start with a video clip of Donald Trump today at a press conference, I believe, where he signed an executive order. It may have been one of the, amongst many executive orders, a few of them were actually designating Antifa a foreign terrorist organization, but he designated like a German group, an Italian group, and 2 Greek anarchist groups as foreign terrorist organizations. Yeah, they're all anarchist groups. But I guess that's his way of, continuing to go after Antifa. But he also said the following in a very short clip I want to play, which I found fascinating. John, can we bring up that clip?
Thank you. The Bible tells us that one of the measures of any society is how it cares for vulnerable children and orphans. So important, and it's so big in the Bible. So as we make America great again, we are going to protect American children in foster care.
So that's getting passed around the internet right now because it's like, wow, so you want to protect children. But I mean, these emails show that at the very least, Donald Trump, like most of our ruling elites, knew exactly what Jeffrey Epstein was doing, especially after the conviction, by the way. And that's what this trove of emails shows too. So we've got the Trump factor. And one thing I want to mention that I thought was really fascinating about this is when the New York Times was reporting about these, 22,000 emails that were dropped by the House Oversight Committee. And just to be clear, they weren't necessarily dropped in a searchable format. So it's actually quite hard to go through them, which is why you're seeing this like drip, drip, trickle of emails by people who are searching them one by one. Like they're not in a PDF format. So it's a bit difficult to go through them. So you're just seeing this trickle like over the past 24 hours. It's like this person emailing with Jeffrey Epstein, this person emailing with Jeffrey Epstein. But in 2015, so there's Michael Wolff, who was the journalist you mentioned, who had written those books about Trump. He was very much in contact with Jeffrey Epstein. And he was in some of these email exchanges, basically goading Jeffrey Epstein into like going after Trump. And in December 2015, it was the night of one of the Republican primary debates. And I'm reading from the New York Times. Mr. Wolff emailed Mr. Epstein and warned him that CNN was planning to ask Trump tonight about his relationship with you, either on air or in scrum afterwards. Mr. Epstein wrote back, if we were able to craft an answer for him, what do you think it should be? Mr. Wolff advised inaction, suggesting that Mr. Trump might try to deny a close relationship with Mr. Epstein. Quote, I think you should let him hang himself, he wrote of Mr. Trump. If he says he hasn't been on the plane or to the House, then that gives you a valuable PR and political currency that could be used to hang him later or save him, generating a debt. And I think that speaks to everything here when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein and who he was and what he was. This guy, I mean, and you see these emails coming out. Everyone was in touch with him, and this was after his conviction. After everybody knew, like there was no reason you could say you didn't know that Jeffrey Epstein was running a sex trafficking ring with underage girls. There's emails with Peter Thiel. There's emails with Larry Summers. There's this really creepy exchange with Tom Barrack, who's like sort of the Middle East envoy, ambassador to Turkey, who's been involved a lot with the negotiations, or, in quotes, negotiations between the Lebanese side and the Israeli side, which is just forcing the Lebanese to like destroy their own country. But like the creepiest interaction. This is from one article laying it out that says, basically, Jeffrey Epstein told Tom Barrack to make me smile with pictures of Tom and a child. That's according to a 2016 email. And then he said, send photos of you and a child, make me smile. He then responded to an email back from Barack saying, photos look good. And it's unclear what child Epstein was referring to. But anyways, there's like that. There's also, you know, in 2011, Jeffrey Epstein received an email from an Emirati billionaire who basically advised Epstein that he could assist with providing shoes with GPS integration to track kids and clients. And Epstein responded with, thanks, great idea. I mean, that's so creepy. But again, it shows you the extent to which this guy was so freaking connected. The level of access is crazy. He had access to prime ministers, to the CEOs of all these major banks, to the CIA intelligence chief. And actually recently, you know, one thing that's really missing from a lot of the reporting we're seeing now, which has turned into this kind of like salacious embarrassment for Donald Trump and the Republican Party, and they're like trying to figure out how to deal with that. One thing that's missing from all this coverage is the fact that Jeffrey Epstein was very close to the Israeli intelligence agency, the Mossad. And Dropsite News has been doing a lot of reporting on this, and it's gotten really no mainstream attention. There's kind of been a blackout on that story. But basically, like we've already kind of talked about on this show, Jeffrey Epstein's relationship to Israel. I mean, after he was initially facing prosecution, he actually almost fled to Israel because, you know, if you are Jewish, you can like basically flee to Israel to like avoid being charged in the country that you're a citizen of or live in. Ghislaine Maxwell, who is his basically his pimp, who's now serving in like some basically minimum security prison and trying to get a commutation from Donald Trump, which is why people suspect she isn't saying how much Trump actually knew and is trying to say he knew nothing. Her father was basically a Mossad agent. More importantly, from what Dropsite is reporting on these leaked emails that were kind of like leaked in this kind of back and forth leaking between the Iranians and Israelis, there's these interactions, many of which are between Jeffrey Epstein and former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak between 2013 and 2016, where they're basically working together on projects to promote Israeli tech partnerships around the world. And Jeffrey Epstein even helped basically broker a back channel between the Israelis and the Russians in Syria. Also helped broker a tech diplomacy or some sort of security deal, between Israel and Mongolia. Like it just goes on and on and on. Basically helped former Israeli official Ehud Barak access these elites that he knew like in Africa and across Asia and across the Middle East. He had an Israeli spy called Yoni Koren spending weeks at a time in his Manhattan home, who also had close ties to CIA Director Leon Panetta. So there's a lot of questions there about, you know, who was serving who and what, but basically this guy was tied to Israeli intelligence. So there's like, that's another angle of the story getting no attention. We'll see if more information about that comes out in this like sort of trickle of discovery of these emails. And of course, there's a vote that's supposed to take place to release more of these emails. Trump is absolutely freaking out because it basically shows at the very least that he absolutely knew about this. Apparently, him and Jeffrey Epstein had some sort of falling out like in the early 2000s. And interestingly enough, one of the things that Trump said is that falling out was due to the fact that one of the most high-profile victims of Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking, Virginia Giuffre, was working initially at the spa in Mar-a-Lago. And Trump was saying that Jeffrey Epstein had stolen her from his spa. It's all just really, this is just disgusting. This is gross. And, you know, it really demonstrates that the ruling class in this country, and by the way, it's a bipartisan problem. Epstein was close to both Democrats and Republicans, but the ruling class in this country was perfectly fine. They just didn't give a shit. They did not care that Jeffrey Epstein was abusing mostly like these working class, poor, underage girls who he was basically forcing into sex slavery. I should say that Virginia Giuffre has said that she never was forced to participate in any acts with Donald Trump. I mean, she's been pretty clear on that. So it's like, but what remains very clear is that Trump is lying. He absolutely did know. He was friends with this guy, but it's not just Donald Trump. And I'll also add that, you know, Donald Trump was freaking out so much yesterday after this trove of documents came out, that not only did he like ignore every single question about Jeffrey Epstein during this like bill signing he was doing, according to CNN, he basically like dragged Pam Bondi, Todd Blanche, Kash Patel, and Lauren Boebert into an emergency reading. And it said that he basically pressured Lauren Boebert to vote against releasing the Epstein files. So this has basically captivated the country. We're going to obviously be hearing much, much more about it. And I think the media is going to stick to the sort of salacious side of it rather than the fact that this is basically like a huge condemnation, I think, of our entire ruling elite. And it includes the media. It even includes exchanges between a New York Times reporter and Jeffrey Epstein, where he's basically trying to help him. And he ultimately ended up losing his job. But the media is kind of complicit in this as well. Not kind of, the media is complicit in this as well. So anyways, just completely disgusting and disgraceful, and says so much about the people that run American empire. They are it's full of either pedophiles or people who are totally fine enabling pedophilia as long as you can give them something in return. And that's what Jeffrey Epstein seems to have done. He seems to have cultivated these relationships with the financial and global elite. Everyone from, again, like I'm talking like prime ministers, presidents, intelligence chiefs, and the CEOs of major banks. He was able to cultivate those relationships, and then he was able to collect blackmail material on people to use as leverage, like he was saying he wanted to try to do with Donald Trump. And that's like, there's so much more. Like, I think this is only the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing is we have to de-essentialize this from just Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, when you look at the history of the United States, also the UK, I mean, there's ties to MI6 and others in there. There is a long history of overlap between criminal figures and the ruling class of the United States, because the biggest sort of hoax that's perpetrated on us is that quote unquote criminals, the mafia, the cartels, whoever, are some like sort of separate vertical of people, separate from other rich people. But the reality is that organized crime, quote unquote, is deeply intertwined and a part of the broader economy that exists. And in the context of the post-World War II intelligence state, the CIA and other entities, the malign purposes that they have, gotten up to have often required them to make relationships, or not required them, they've chosen to make relationships with, quote unquote, organized crime figures to carry out things in the shadows that they don't want people to know that they are doing. But there is a long history of prominent criminals being deeply tied to the most important people. I mean, the person who comes to mind, of course, is Frank Costello, the so-called prime minister of the mafia, who, could do anything for you in the 1950s and the early 1960s. You murdered somebody, you call him and he'll fix the case and make sure the police don't investigate, or that if they've investigated, the judge throws it out. Sort of immortalized, by the way, in The Godfather, the second Godfather, which is, quite a bit of this. I mean, it's not based on a true story per se, but people who've seen the movie, that there's the opening and there's that senator, and he is caught in a bed with a dead sex worker. And of course, there is the mob attorney from the Corleone family. And he says, well, thankfully, Senator, my brother owns this hotel. And then, of course, they use that relationship in order to blackmail him in different ways. And I think that we've seen, obviously, the involvement of the mafia in the many different plots that were hatched against Cuba. We've seen different elements that have been alleged in different contexts and different pieces. But I think that's part of the problem that people don't fully understand, is that they're sort of shocked by these things. But in fact, what we can learn from, verified public historical information is that it's actually not that rare that there are high up criminal figures who are a big part of sort of the nexus of how power and money are moving in society, because they can play particular roles to do particular things that people either don't want to be known, don't want to be associated with, or are looking to have, some form of something that they want that they can then get from these people, whether it be, favors or sex or drugs or whatever it may be. And so I think it is, you're right, an indictment of the sort of broader system that has really, I think, skyrocketed in the post-World War II era with the creation of these massive Western intelligence agencies trying to control the world, who I think have gone to great lengths to establish networks that involve many people doing many very bad things in order to carry out things that are also bad. So, it's something that's worth looking into. But when you start to look into it, it starts to get deep. You look at a guy like Johnny Roselli in the mafia, who is so deeply involved in Hollywood and the music industry and all these other factors that were there that people were using to manipulate certain, elements in different ways. So, and I don't want to say too much about it. I mean, I think that is sort of speaks for itself. I think a lot more is going to come out here. I mean, I think the Michael Wolff thing you pointed out is very interesting, as well as the New York Times. It seems Epstein was a very active source for many journalists, and that will be another interesting part of the story to watch.
I was going to say Epstein offered a reporter photos of Donald and girls in bikinis in my kitchen, according to one of these email exchanges. So yeah, I mean, he just to go to what you were saying as a source, used as a source for the media. And again, this is after this guy was convicted. He was a convicted sex offender and still being taken seriously by the media, still being taken seriously in elite circles on both sides of the political spectrum. It's sick. And then there's Ghislaine Maxwell, who is getting literally right now, she's getting like special treatment. There's reports she's getting an endless supplies of as much toilet paper she wants. She gets access to the internet. People bring her like in time with people with computers so she can basically fill out her commutation form. And she's basically trying to say Trump had nothing to do with anything and didn't know anything. And it's obvious she's doing it so she can get a commutation. This is a convicted liar and sexual predator who destroyed people's lives. These are people who talk all the time about how crime and we want to help save the children of America from criminals. You guys are criminals. But you know what? These are also people who are totally fine, carrying out a genocide in Gaza. And again, on both sides of the political spectrum. So of course, why would they care that somebody's a pedophile, a convicted pedophile? Who cares? Because everything at the end of the day is about power, about access, and about saving your own ass too. Because one thing that Jeffrey Epstein did is he collected information about the people that were with him. He recorded conversations. He kept a diary of who was on his quote unquote air fuck one. That's what he called it, which included a lot of people, including U.S. former presidents and princes from the UK, like Prince Andrew, and prime ministers from Israel. And also, he did all that as leverage and to protect himself from getting into trouble. And then in 2019, the guy supposedly commits suicide. I mean, nobody believes Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide. The camera happened to be off. The security camera happened to just not be working. And the security card happened to just fall asleep. And this guy who was apparently in good spirits the day before commits suicide when we know he has information, damning information about all of these elites who knew exactly what he was doing and either participated in it, cases, or did not care. And yeah, like you said, indictment. And yes, is this new? No, there's probably so many stories like this we don't know about. There's a lot more about the Jeffrey Epstein stuff we don't know about. But it will be interesting to see how it impacts Donald Trump because, one thing that his base is all about is being against the pedophiles. But then somehow a lot of their leaders end up being pedophiles themselves. But, I think a lot of the MAGA people are saying this is a big conspiracy. Others are maybe a little bit disillusioned. But more importantly, it'll be interesting to see what happens in Congress as they release more. But then, it's also going to be used as a massive distraction because the U.S. is still, amassing forces in the Caribbean to potentially bomb Venezuela and doing all the other horrible things that U.S. empire does around the world while, be allowing insurance companies to basically raise our premiums to whatever the hell they want next year. So it, is also something to keep the American public, especially if they don't cover it the right way. If it stays in the sort of realm of just salacious embarrassment rather than the serious criminality of people who have a shit ton of power, then it's going to be just something that the media and, the elites of this country use to distract people in like a kind of reality TV sort of gossipy soap opera drama kind of way that doesn't really amount to anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we'll just have to see what happens here. And thanks for the correction there. Those Michael Wolff emails. I said 2019. It was 2015, leading into the primaries there in 2016. But we will keep following this like we keep following everything. I think that will bring us to the end of the show today. Rania, anything you want to say before we close out?
Yes, I want to remind people that they need to make sure they hit the like button, that they are subscribed to Breakthrough News, that they've tapped the bell for notifications, because YouTube just is not feeding us to the people the over 1 million subscribers that we have. It is amazing. Over 1 million subscribers and 300 people watching. Amazing that can happen on a channel this big. Not alleging anything, just smiling at YouTube and nodding at, we see what you're doing. And we'll see if we can fix this. But in the meantime, so that you don't have our content made invisible to you, please make sure you hit the like button, leave a comment. It'll keep boosting us in your algorithm. And also make sure that you've tapped the bell and turned on notifications for Breakthrough News so that you get a notification whenever we have a new live stream coming up or whenever we've got new content, like my show Dispatches. Just did a really fantastic episode with Zoe Alexandra about Venezuela. I have an upcoming episode I'm so excited to share with you, hopefully coming out tomorrow, with the incredible Ghada Karmi. She's British Palestinian, Nakba survivor. We talked about so much. One thing in particular, do you know the New York Times, Eugene, lives in on top of her family's ethnically cleansed home in Jerusalem, the New York Times bureau chief, and has since the 1980s. We talk about that wild story. Got an upcoming episode with the incredible Yanis Varoufakis. Keep your eyes out for that. And you might not see those episodes because, again, YouTube is not feeding us to our subscribers. So make sure that you tap that bell so that you get a notification when those episodes do go up so you don't miss them. Really, really great conversation with brilliant people that YouTube just, doesn't want you to see. Oh, also, Eugene, one more thing. Can't forget. Sorry. Patreon.com/breakthrough news. Become a member for as little as $5 a month. And then you'll definitely get notifications for all our episodes. Because, Patreon still tells you when the show you pay for has new content.
Well, shout out to all of our ongoing donors there at patreon.com. Really appreciate you. Shout out to everybody who is watching. Shout out to all of our guests, as always. On behalf of myself, on behalf of Rania, on behalf of the whole Breakthrough News team, we will see you next time.